Hello everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial in which we're going to be looking at and planning an answer to an evaluation essay on emissions and looking at what approach you should take in order to maximise your chances of getting the full 25 marks. So there are two main types of essay question that you need to prepare for your law exams, and I have done a separate video tutorial on those two types of questions on essays and scenarios, so it would be useful to watch that as well as watching this video. But today I'm just going to talk through the essays with you. So an essay is, well, I've got an example here in the context of emissions. You're being asked to discuss whether the law on emissions strikes a fair balance between public policy and legal principle. So an essay is a question, really. It's talking about a particular topic that you've studied, in this case emissions, and no matter how it's phrased, in a nutshell, what it means is, what is the law on emissions, and is it good or bad? Okay, so it's an evaluation essay. It is wanting you to say what the law on emissions is and discuss whether it's good or bad. And this particular question is saying, do we have a fair balance between public policy and legal principle? So it's trying to give you a clue that it's really getting at. Do we strike a good balance between public policy wanting people to act and look after each other, and also the defendant's own individual rights just to go about his business without being expected to get involved in potentially dangerous situations? So it's actually giving you a clue as the angle to take with the essay. But never let the wording of an essay put you off, okay? Because just remember what I've said. It's what is the law, on your particular topic. So this case emissions, I'm just trying to highlight it. So what is the law on that? So it's wanting all your cases, your rules, your definitions, and to go through and evaluate them all. And when you're looking at an evaluation essay, which will be on exam 3, they're always worth 25 marks. And the way that the marks are broken down on the mark scheme is always the same. So AO1 stands for Assessment Objective 1, and you get 10 out of the 25 marks for your knowledge and understanding of the law. And I call that parrot points, because it's like being a parrot. You get 10 points for just repeating everything that's in your booklet. Yeah, so when you're looking at emissions, you will get AO1 marks for saying, in the case of Pitwood, it was held that a duty to act can be created through a contract. And that's just being a parrot. You're just repeating that law. And of course, it's really important that you know your cases off by heart, you know your principles, so that you can easily pick up your AO1 marks. But you'll notice that you actually get more marks, 15 out of the 25, for AO3. And AO3, Assessment Objective 3, is your analysis and evaluation. So once you've said what a rule is, you get AO1, you then want to analyse and evaluate that rule, and then you'll get AO3. So to give the example, another example from emissions, we could say, let's pick the case of Stone and Dobinson. So I'd say in the case of Stone and Dobinson, the principle is that you owe a duty to act through assumption of care. That's my AO1. My next sentence in my essay would be, this is a good decision to reach and it reflects public policy in that if you volunteer to look after someone, you should look after them, and this is going to protect vulnerable people. But the flip side of that, because when you're evaluating, you can often say good and bad points, is you could say, however, it could seem harsh because in another situation, a person might not realise that they're assuming to care. They might not fully understand what they're taking on. It might not be quite fair to put the burden on them. Of course, it was very extreme in Stone and Dobinson now. And that will get you your AO3. So you say what the law is and you evaluate it. So that's how you pick up marks in an essay. So if I just flick back to the essay that we're planning, you're being asked to discuss whether all the law on emissions strikes this fair balance. Now, in order to answer that, I've put on this slide here, and I've used colour to try and make it clear to you that when you're writing an essay, any evaluative essay, you always want to start with an introduction. So you identify the main issue of the question, and you can refer back to the question in your introduction. Don't just write it out and not say anything about it, because then you're just wasting your time. But you can use the question to frame your introduction, and I'll show you an example of that shortly. And then you're going to just go through and explain what the law on, in this case, emissions is. So my tip is just go through all of it in the order that we've studied it in your booklet. So you would say the general rule is that there's no duty to act. That's a rule. So that's my AO1, black font. Then I want to AO3 evaluate that rule. So I've said the general rule is you don't have to act. In order to analyse and evaluate that, think, why do we have that rule? And of course, we have that general rule because there would be practical problems, for example, in how many people have to act in a situation. There's also the considerations of people having to put themselves at risk to help someone else, or they might make the situation worse, and they might potentially be sued if they do make the situation worse. So I'd be pointing out all the reasons why we have that general rule. And then I'd go on to my next rule. And again, I would just be thinking of my booklet in order and think, right, okay, there are exceptions to that. The first exception is duty through a contract, Pitt would. I would explain that. And then I would evaluate it. Say, why do we have that rule? Why is it we expect people who have signed a contract to act? And that one's quite obvious, hopefully, that if you've promised, you've said you'll act, it's only fair that you then do act. And you can say, you know, whilst it wouldn't be necessarily fair to expect a passerby to act and try and save someone who's drowning, if you're a lifeguard and that's your job and you actually get paid to try and help them, then that's different. You should be under a duty to act. So you're going to go through, and I've put etc. here, just go through explaining all the rules and evaluating as you go. And you want to conclude by linking back to your question. And as it's the first time we've had a go at an evaluation essay, I thought I'd just go through a plan, and this is very bullet pointing, just to give you the idea. So if I was doing this essay, I would define emissions first of all. So an emission is a failure to act. The general rule is we don't expect people to act, and they're black because that's my AO1. I've then done some AO3, that the reason we have this general rule is it's unfair to expect people to risk their own life. There's practical difficulties. I might bring in and talk about some countries do expect people to act, Good Samaritan law, I could evaluate that. Exceptions to the rule, list the 6 situations, talk about contract, say that it's fair to expect people to act. But there are other difficulties, that sometimes someone with a job, like a teacher, we know they have to do something if there's a fire, but what's going to be enough? Yeah, it's not necessarily clear in all jobs how much a person has to do to discharge their duty. Explain all of Gibbons and Proctor, and I've put there for evaluation that it's fair to expect parents to act. That's going to reinforce moral boundaries. I've then gone on to another slide. I'd talk about Stone and Dobinson. It's protecting the vulnerable. Dithen, you could talk about, well, seems fair that if the police have special training, we can expect them to do more. But I could counter that with the fact that they're only human. Talk about creation of a dangerous situation and how that might seem fair if they've actually created the danger themselves. And we're not expecting him to become, a firefighter and try and tackle fire himself, but we would expect him to call somebody, knock on a door, do something. So pointing out that you're not necessarily expecting them to do a lot to discharge their duty, but you are expecting them to do something. Talk about duty through an act of parliament. You could use the Road Traffic Act as an example. And how we have that, the reason we've got this act is that we are trying to protect society, that it's a public policy decision. Always nice to link back to the question where you possibly can. Could get into all the moral debate between, is there a moral difference between an act and an omission? People generally think that doing an act is worse than not doing something. So that's a thought that many people would say, but perhaps we could counter that and say, okay, stabbing someone is really, really bad. But is it not equally bad, or perhaps even worse, to watch a child starve to death for months and months and months, suffering and suffering and suffering, and then they die? You know, the stabbing, it's over quick, isn't it? It's a crime of passion, heat of the moment situation. But there's something very calculated and potentially a bit evil about letting neglect happen for a long time, which will be classed as an omission. So you could talk all about that. Remember that in all of your booklets, at the very back of the booklets, there's always criticisms and reform. So all of this evaluation, bullet point, suggestion, that'll be in your booklets. I'm just trying to show you with these slides how I would be structuring my essay. And a good way of concluding your essay is always to say, okay, so we've identified some problems. What are the possible reforms? And again, you can look at all the suggestions that are in your booklet there. Okay, so I hope that was helpful, looking at how we would go about tackling an evaluation question. And it could be that you get an essay on a different area. We've not studied murder yet, but you might get an essay on murder, where it might say something like, discuss whether the law on murder is satisfactory. And in that situation, it'd be a different question, but it'd be the same marks available, and you would go through the exact same steps. Identifying the issue, explaining your first rule of murder, evaluating it, explaining the next rule of murder, and evaluating it. So it's always going to be this same structure, whatever the question you're looking at. But obviously this one, we've been focused on omissions today. So have a go, write it up, use your notes if you want to, or challenge yourself if you're feeling really confident. You could have a go at this essay just from memory, or maybe do a plan first and then write it up. In the exam, you would have 45 minutes to answer a 25 mark scenario. But for now, with this being our first essay, I don't want you to be worrying about timing or anything at this point. Just be concentrating on getting the nicest answer you possibly can.